records. Have you guys managed to work that out or not? Okay. Where are we here? You wanted, I've got a list of exhibits here. There was a couple of pages that were offered to be removed and or replaced this morning, I gather, and at least a couple of the exhibits. So,
Judge, I don't know if you've made any markings on your copy, but I have a copy where I've highlighted the pertinent passages. It might be easier for you to follow along with the change copy.
no, I'm fine with this, I think. If it becomes problematic, then maybe you can offer that to me. All right, so I guess we should go this one at a time. You got 2026A?
Correct, Your Honor. So this is a discharge. It was already read from by Rochelle Pastelis, Pasteris. So this was read from a number of paragraphs.
Well, what's the objection to 2026A?
Your Honor, but it's cumulative. We've already had the testimony about it, and the underlying records don't need to be admitted as well, since they've already had testimony about it. Plus, there are additional things that are in these records that, in these particular pages that weren't actually covered for purposes of the testimony. It's otherwise relevant.
It just got an email. Those are in addition, not replacements. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. So this is not a replacement for anything, this is an addition to whatever we had before. Okay.
I just got an email. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you got, but
Oh, never mind, I'm just, Mrs. Winnie just told me that the pages we got on a couple of these were replacements. And what she has now learned is that they're not replacements, is that they're in addition to, they're supplements. So, a good thing I didn't toss out the old ones. I've still got the other ones here. All right. So anyway, you're saying it's cumulative and there's things in here that weren't testified to. I'm sure that's true. They can't, the entire medical record wouldn't have been read. Mhm.
correct, and also they're just simply not relevant. And there's a 403 issue here. Mr. Ellis is not on trial here. My understanding is that the court was allowing some mental health history, understanding that it was tethered to an expert's opinion, that somehow some of this history apparently was predictive of behavior on that night. There hasn't been any of that kind of testimony. I don't see that his random history and mental health history would otherwise be useful. And for that reason, we object to this a number of other records.
Well, I might agree with you on a sort of case-by-case basis, but of course, Mr. Ellis's mental state on the night in question is an issue.
Correct. With these records, for example, 2026A relates to a date of service of August 6th, 2019. And there's been no testimony or evidence to suggest that that somehow is relevant to his behavior on March 3rd, 2020. And I think that's the concern that the state has too with respect to the jury. And the jury are not medical experts. And just putting in records of this nature.
Well, one of them happens to be a physician, but
Well, yes, he's also the fourth alternate, but
Yeah.
I agree, he's a potential jury. But they're not medical experts, and even if all of them were doctors, I mean, you're leaving them to sort out, here's prior history of Mr. Ellis seen in August of 2019, and somehow they're supposed to determine what this means in terms of the issues they have to decide in this case, which are, I mean, to be generous, the issue of the court saying with respect to how he behaved in March of 2020, March 3rd, 2020, but then also what he died from. And that's not something that should be done by just putting in medical records and saying, here, look at these, look at his history. I mean, on balance, you're just talking about essentially 404B evidence, a prior mental health history, a prior drug history, a prior criminal history. Those things are not otherwise admissible against a victim in a homicide case. And therefore, these records really don't do anything other than serve the purpose of essentially trying to paint Mr. Ellis in a bad light. And so that's the guess I would just say that I think that this, harkens back to the days of the rape shield law, before the rape shield law, when, courts were allowing in somebody's sexual history in order to say that therefore they couldn't have been a victim of a rape. I mean, we're talking about things that happened in Mr. Ellis's life, prior to this incident that really have no connection at all to this particular incident.
Well, if they had no connection at all, I'd agree with you, but I'm not sure that all of this has no connection at all. And there has been testimony, for instance, about and is within these records about Mr. Ellis having a psychotic reaction to the use of methamphetamine, that he had a history of schizoaffective kinds of issues, that by his own comment to his caretakers, that his use of methamphetamine exacerbated those symptoms, which included, at least in one spot, paranoia, although he was asked about, I think the sister or the mother was asked about Mr. Ellis's paranoia, and she kind of denied it, although she acknowledged that he certainly had some of these schizophrenic issues. Oh, what was the other one? And of course, conditions that relate to his health, in terms of his heart and that kind of stuff. There were also parts of that, because these things also bear on not just his motive at the time, but also on whether or not there's a factual basis to think that there might have been some other basis for his death, which of course is an issue in the case. And although I'm not know that it's particularly disputed that he had a heart condition, for instance.
It's not, and the court has already permitted cross-examination on those factors. And as the court has acknowledged previously, the fact that someone has schizoaffective disorder doesn't mean that they're schizophrenic every minute, or that they're behaving in a particular way.
Oh, no,
And so,
no,
again,
but there's evidence that he was behaving that sort of way.
well, the only evidence that there is from the defendant's statements.
Well, yeah, but I can't say that that doesn't exist.
No, I agree. I'm not saying that you can't say that it doesn't exist.
So if you say, for instance, that it only comes from the defendant's statements, and then there's medical documentation that suggests that that wasn't a lunatic statement by them, then that tends to support their statement, right? As opposed to the state being able to say, it's only the defendants who say this. Now, no, it's not just the defendants. There's medical evidence that documents what they're saying.
Well, Your Honor, again, it's untethered to this particular time.
Well, some of it may or may not be.
Said that
Well-
because in the past he has exhibited or acknowledged that he has some psychosis, therefore, when he takes meth, that therefore on this occasion he had it. And otherwise, it's frankly propensity evidence.
No,
They're
well,
saying that because he acknowledged these things in the past and he behaved that way in the past, therefore it's indicative of, or it's somehow relevant. And there just simply isn't a tie there. I mean,
it creates the if this was a one-off deal, that's one thing. If this had happened before, which there's evidence that it did, then that's another, it seems to me.
But there's absolutely.
Well, I'm not going to re-argue that, but I'm willing to discuss individual aspects of this. For instance, the first page that I've got in front of me for Exhibit 2026A, which is Bates stamps 5876. You guys all on the same page with me?
Yes, Your Honor.
In the middle here, it's got this business about his getting out of jail or prison in 2017, work release.
Yeah, that should be redacted.
Yeah, it should be.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
Not in my redaction, it's not been proposed as a redaction.
no, that's right. It hasn't been proposed for redaction, but I saw this and I thought it should be redacted.
I agree. Ms. Heath, I also, we asked what other additional redactions you guys want. And so I'm happy to start suggesting them myself, but that's part of this conversation.
Well, I guess part of the conversation that needs to happen is for the state to understand what specific parts. And now it sounds like you have something that you've highlighted. You know, what you gave us were just records that had all kinds of other information in it. So
Well, they
if
do.
there are specific things that you want and limited things, then the state would look at that. But what you gave us includes all of this history that frankly is oral OB evidence.
And that's why when we were having the discussion, when I sent you the email, I said, please let me know if there are redactions you'd like to make this as well. So some of these have already been read from, like the one we're looking at right no, I mean, it's in evidence, so
So I'm not sure which portions have been read from this one, and that's why we're asking, because you're proposing them, and you think that somebody's read from it, that you'd like to know the specific portions that you want to have admitted as opposed to.
Well, you guys should address your comments to me instead of each other, but I guess the deal is that if you, it seems to me that that you guys have not had some kind of good faith conversation about this, and you want me to go through, I don't know, 100 or plus pages of documents one by one and say which should be in and which should not. I'm perfectly willing to talk about them that way, but it's going to slow things down. And really shouldn't be done on the dime of the jurors. Okay, so now I'm looking at the next. I'm not sure if there's any particular problems with any of the rest of it, but I'm certainly willing to hear from Ms. Eakes as to that. As to the, although on page 852,
which exhibit is this, Your Honor?
Bates 852, which is, I think, part of the same exhibit.
I don't have 852 as something that was provided to us.
Well, it says GLMHC 000852 at the bottom.
852, under the other grades. On their judgment.
There was a discharge summary. Is it just important for the discharge date? Because there's a whole bunch of stuff here about involvement in the legal system.
Correct. So this was read, the only thing that was read from this was the clinician attempted to reach out via phone and mail, however, attempts were unsuccessful at the discharge date.
So,
Perhaps, Your Honor, we should have Mr. Conrad and I should sit down page by page and see what they're actually proposing. Because I'm not even sure where he saw that or where it's from, but there's a lot of other stuff, obviously, that the state objects to with respect to that. And even on the first document you just looked at, I mean, there are portions in here that talk about his Parks referral, the covering of his expenses. None of that would be relevant or admissible, and that's on dates 807 or Rankin
right.
5877. So I mean, I think that if they're going to more limit than what they're asking, then we can have a conversation, we should have a conversation about what exactly they're trying to put in. What I was given and what was submitted to the state was wholesale records.
Well, yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, I'm imagining, since I don't have every single Bates number in these sequences, that there are lots of other medical records that are not included in this. So, it's, or in that sense, it's already been redacted of a kind. But yeah, I agree, you guys should have that conversation, because we shouldn't be doing this on my time, not this kind of volume on a page-by-page kind of basis, or even paragraph-by-paragraph kind of basis. If you guys can agree on most of it, that's great. If you can't, then we'll have to do that. And then, of course, to the extent you don't agree, we'll have to do it too.
Understood. Judge, is there anything, I guess, before we embark on this conversation, is there anything else on these records that you want?
Well, I noticed the HARP thing too, actually, at page 807, I think that Ms. Eakes just talked about. At 852, that paragraph, again, about involvement in the legal system, all or most of that should probably come out. Maybe not all, but most. I went through. I went through most of this. And some of this I thought, well, it probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference one way or the other. On page, and this is now exhibit 981A. This is not too big a deal, I think, but It says page 44 at the bottom left-hand corner of at least the one document I'm looking at. At the top, it says encounter level documents. This is apparently from Good Samaritan Hospital. One thing that may be confusing here is at the very bottom, it looks like there's maybe some kind of I don't know, a document identifier or something that says September 23, 2020. I don't know if that's a fax date or what that is, but that's clearly not a date of medical service to Mr. Ellis. So I don't know what it's about. It should probably go out. And then in the narrative, the source of this is not, some of the source of this appears to be from Mr. Ellis, but some of this also appears to be from law enforcement. It seems to me the materials that are from law enforcement are hearsay and probably not admissible. So I noted that. On the next exhibit, which is 984A, and it looks like the Bates number on this is 0000799. You guys with me?
Yes.
Near the bottom of this, it talks about other miscellany, shot in the leg in 2015. This comes up a couple of different times where he's being shot in the foot as opposed to shot in the leg. I'm not sure exactly what the deal is about this. It's not entirely clear what that's about. It comes up a couple, 2-3 times in these records. It isn't clear, at least that I couldn't spot. Maybe it's in here and I just missed it, but because it comes up a couple of times. This sounds like maybe this was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. At least there's a kind of suspicion of that. Or maybe it's that the police shot him at some point, or somebody else did. But anyway, whether his being shot in the foot or the leg, I'm not sure at the moment how that has anything to do with anything here that I could spot. So it seems to me that kind of stuff should be out. And as I say, I don't think I made a notation about all the things about the foot, but it's in here a number of different times. And in part it has to do with him trying to get him in for treatment or whatever, and him leaving, I think, at one point. Anyway, so there was that.
And I think the court would note it's in exhibit 2004, 2005, 2006. These are mainly records about his seeking treatment for the shooting to his foot, which again, from 2015.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's the kind of thing I had reference to. I mean, at 2004A, the very first page of it, I don't think it's got a page number on it, but the very first page of that one, at the very top again, about chief complaints, foot injury, shot in the foot last Sunday, seen at Allenmore and St. Joe's Medical Center, SJMC.
And it states that he just got in jail on Monday.
Yeah, I mean, there's that kind of stuff too. I mean, so I don't know why this. What would be the point of this?
I agree. I think that stuff should be redacted.
So what's the point of any of this particular?
There's a notation in this emergency record that indicates that he affirms auditory hallucination. The voices tell me negative things about me. Memory loss. Cannot remember what I ate for dinner last night. I'm so high on that. He then goes on to tell.
That's the third page of this document.
Correct.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So again, indicating how methamphetamine is affecting him. And then there's a notation about his uncontrolled hypertension as well on 4433.
Well, on that third page again, the business about the chief complaint, and which precedes immediately those comments, which apparently are statements from him. I don't remember if he talks about memory problems elsewhere. Although I'm not sure his memory would have a whole lot to do with this case. There's elsewhere in the records that his onset of methamphetamine use was years before this date, which is 2015. So I'm not sure how important it is for establishing that. So I don't know if we need this particular exhibit at all, because at the moment I'm not seeing anything that is particularly new or useful. And I don't know whether Ms. Eakes' 205 and 206 are similar. I don't know off the top of my head. Let me take a quick look here.
In 205A, what's important there,
I'm sorry.
When you say 205,
It's,
I hear 205.
it's 2005A,
Exactly.
not 205, it's 2005A.
so 2005.
Mhm.
There's a notation in there. On the top, it's Rankin Medical Expert 520.
That I'm not seeing. This is on,
2005A,
I think I'm there. Which page of it is that?
520.
See, my copies don't, or at least aren't showing any pages for a while here. This is a longer exhibit. So maybe in the back there's numbers. I'm not seeing any numbers. Tell me more about it. What are you looking at?
Presenting problem, concern. Patient presents himself to the emergency department. Patient is alert, oriented, future focused, with plans to enter treatment in the next 24 hours. He denies SI to SI, which I believe stands for suicidal ideations. With the social worker, he goes on to say that patient does state that he has auditory hallucinations. They're praising me. Patient states that the auditory hallucinations are not bothersome, but they do increase when he uses.
Yeah, I see a couple of different references to that,
Clearly the
but
relevant.
I'm not finding that particular one.
Okay.
But certainly the business about the gunshot wound is out, and some of this stuff may be, whatever. And again, some of this stuff is repetitive because it recapitulates stuff was said at a prior deal, which is what medical records tend to do. But, so you guys can look at that one too. 206A is a different 2006A rather, is a different healthcare record. But also from that, I think that same time frame of July 2015. Because the other one's from the Franciscan system.
I'm sorry, which exhibit are you looking at,
So now, the one we had been looking at was Franciscan. 2006A is the Tacoma General Hospital, which is multi-care, but it's about the same time frame. And, it's talking about, in part, among other things, it talks about a gunshot wound to his foot.
Just in general, there's a number of notations in this record again that talk about him being unmentioned with methamphetamine, being delusional. that he was combative when being transported to the hospital, leaving against medical advice.
And what does leaving against medical advice have to do with it?
Or being combative in 2015 at the hospital.
Well, it has,
If he's on methamphetamine, I mean, I suppose it could have something to do.
Well, if
But
there's any evidence he's on that,
I think there is in the sense of his own report, but
I think the records say that he used meth 2 days before. I don't know if there's any particular connection to it.
don't know. But he was seeking medical care at the Franciscan system, St. Joe's, and also sort of at the same time not being willing to actually engage in it much either. So it wasn't, so this is not inconsistent with that, but it doesn't mean it's particularly relevant to this exercise. Anyway, so there's a lot of records there, but they don't really say anything but the same stuff over and over again. I mean, there's a point here where it's on page 116 of that exhibit, it goes down a ways.
I'm sorry, which exhibit and what page?
Same exhibit we were on, page 116, which talks about not having used it in the past 2 days, but it also says he uses it daily. Talking about methamphetamine.
I don't know if this would be useful, but I think it would be helpful to understand the parameters of what the court thinks is inclined to let in. It sounds like
Well, the idea that it's cumulative is not going to be particularly impressive. Irrelevant will be far more impressive to me.
Your Honor, I guess I just want to make sure I understand what I'm hearing the court say. So hallucinations while on meth, references to hallucinations while on meth is something that's relevant. Is that right?
Could be.
Okay.
Well, he has hallucinations. He claims to have hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, independently of having methamphetamine. What he has said from time to time is it gets worse when he uses methamphetamine.
Right, so is the court saying that any references to auditory hallucinations is somehow relevant, and then also any auditory or any hallucinations while on meth is also?
Well, at least it can be to some extent. I mean, there's a point at which it becomes cumulative, but there's also a situation here where we're worried about showing the extent of this, it seems to me. But there is information elsewhere that suggests he'd had auditory hallucinations for years. And once you establish that, I don't know why we have to keep bouncing the rubble on this and say it over and over and over again. Then maybe cumulative has got more power.
Already established on cross, several experts.
Well, it's nice to have a medical record that backs it up too. But once we've done it once, I'm not sure you have to do it over and over and over again.
And then, as I understand it, the court's saying another category would be heart-related or breathing-related issues, is that
Well,
right?
sure.
Okay. And then references to psychosis while on meth, is that right?
Well, certainly. Or any other psychosis, I suppose.
And then are you also putting in all admissions to the use of methamphetamine?
No, not all of them. I mean, he says he uses it daily and that kind of stuff in a couple of different places. I'm not sure it needs to say it over and over and over again. And it seems to me that we've got that in the more recent records, for instance. So when we go now, for instance, to 2019A, here it may be relevant in part because it talks about how he's been sober. Now, this is an assessment on November 7, 2019. And he says that's kind of a big deal for me. And there's a business about his tooth, which matters to make it clear, although I think it is clear now, but to make it clear that was his teeth injuries were not caused in this event. Because I know one of forensic pathologist was, thought it maybe that it happened to him in this event and didn't. So that kind of thing would probably be in. On a medical history, it talks about a bullet in his foot at some point. I don't know, again, whether that's necessary or it could be redacted. That's at page 595, I'm sorry, the GLMHC number 880. Rankai medical expert number 5950. Then at 5952, under history of legal involvement, again, there's some things here that probably should not be in. So I made a note of that. Those were ones that at least I spotted. And there's a lot of pages here that just doesn't have a whole lot of significance, I don't think, in some of those medical records.
Would the court prefer that we just remove those pages?
Well, if you don't need, they're, well, yeah, I mean, when I was looking at, see if I can find it again. Well, here we are, under 2006A. I think I found it now. It starts lower left-hand corner, page 62. Talking about, a radiology interface. Doesn't say a whole lot more than that. The next page says, no notes of this type exist for this encounter. And that's all that's on this page. Right? It just has a name on page 60, the next page after that. EKG results. No results for this type exist for this admission. To page 65. Same with imaging results on page 66. Page 67, lab results, no result. Procedure results, no results. Page 68, 69. I don't know. There's about 8 pages right there that are just almost empty. And I don't see the point of them.
Understood. I guess
But
The
they're,
just have the pages that are relevant to specific entries that they want to be looked at. As opposed to the whole stack of them. There's a lot of personal medical information on that ballot, and I understand the court. thinks it's important, but
well, this, it's, it happens when we get medical records, there's lots of information on them, and yet some of it is admissible and some of it is not. Some of those kind of identifying factors are admissible to show we're talking about the same patient. But some of the things like I mentioned where there's a patient history that substantially relies on what the police told the hospital, which is perfectly reasonable for a hospital to have, but is not necessarily admissible evidence in our case. So that kind of stuff should go out on the which I pointed out earlier. So yes, have your meeting. You wanted to know if there was a few things that I'd spotted. Those were some of the things I spotted as problematic. Okay. Are we ready to resume with our witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
Great. Let's have the witness. Let's have the jury, rather, and let's have the witness. Okay, Mr. Conrad, you may continue when you're ready.
Thank you. Morning, Mr. Lewis.
Good morning.
We'll give the jury a second to.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we left off yesterday talking about methamphetamine and obviously overall toxicology. And one of the things that you talked about was some of the symptomology associated with therapeutic levels of methamphetamine. And I want to ask you about what are some of the symptomology that you generally see with an individual that has higher levels of meth?
Sure. So just sort of to recap, when an individual is prescribed a dose of methamphetamine, very often what we're going to see is increase in heart rate, increase in metabolism, the wakefulness, and in some circumstances you're going to see a bit of fidgetiness. As the dose gets higher, what's going to happen is you're going to see even more of these symptoms, or they're going to become more obvious. So at higher doses, other things may also start coming into play. So for instance, when a individual is dosed with it, again, the biochemistry is essentially increased, and so very often the individual will then lose their ability to focus on specific tasks. So in driving, as an example, when we're operating a vehicle, we're taking in a lot of information, we're also processing, we're prioritizing, and we're kind of weeding out what's important, what's maybe not so important at that moment. When we have individuals that are dosed with a CNS stimulant such as methamphetamine, what can happen is, again, they're going to start losing that focus. So they see a bird in the sky, and that's what they're going to focus on instead of the task at hand. So they lose that ability to prioritize information. Other things are that they may actually lose the ability to properly assess risk because, again, they're not prioritizing what is important and what is not important at that moment.
And what about individuals that are experiencing potentially toxic levels of meth?
So at that point, what can happen is they are so overloading their system that the neurotransmitters are firing, and at that point, you could actually see different systems shutting down because it's so overwhelmed. Sure.
You said the neurotransmitters.
Hang on. How about I just stick closer to it?
So you said the neurotransmitters are firing. What do you mean by that?
Right. So in everyday situations, if you will, when you're trying to do an action or when you're thinking, there are neural pathways that are going to be activated. So there is going to be a certain level of neurotransmitters that are released, and that is going to create a cascade of other neurotransmitter agents, which will then go down the pathway. So if I want to move my arm, for instance, the thought of that will start a cascade and start activating the muscles. So when I reach my target, there's going to be another set of signals sent for me to pick up, let's say, this pen. And then when I'm writing, there's another cascade that is going to be set up. So when an individual has stimulants on board, for instance, that pathway becomes over-exaggerated. So instead of firing, let's say, 1 unit, it's actually the brain is starting to release like 10 units. And so everything is going to be exaggerated.
And so how does that manifest itself? What do you see in an individual that has a high level of methamphetamine and that's starting to happen?
Sure. So what may happen is that, depending, in this case for methamphetamine, again, it is a CNS stimulant. So it's going to increase the activity of the central nervous system. So again, with the brain, instead of being able to focus, they may lose the ability to focus. With metabolism, you're going to see an increase in heart rate, and increase in body temperature is also possible.
And what about delusions?
It is possible because, again, the individual is not taking the information that is being supplied by the environment and properly analyzing it and properly prioritizing and then responding to it.
You're talking in generalities.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And so each person that uses a certain type of drug may have a certain type of reaction to it.
Correct.
And how does underlying mental health issues play into that?
It is possible, again, that if the individual has difficulties, that they may be exaggerated when that individual is dosed with this kind of chemical.
So I want to ask next about kind of some of the work that's been done specific to this case.
Sure.
And I'm going to hand you I'm going to hand you a couple exhibits.
Mm-hmm.
And this is exhibit 267, 266, and what's already been admitted is 2583. Permission to approach her?
Do they need to see it?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
And I'll ask you about those documents. In particular, there's one document with your signature on it.
Yes.
And can you tell the jury what that document is?
Sure. So when the laboratory receives
Which number was it?
Sorry,
267. Yes. So when the lab receives evidence, then there is a procedure that we will go through to assign it what's called an ST number. So that's a state toxicology number. So that's our internal tracking system. So once it's put into the system, then very often we'll start doing testing so that we know how to associate the data back to a certain file. In this case, this document here, 267, is the final report for this case, and it contains information as to what was done, who was done, and date that it was done.
Okay, and what's the ST number associated with that?
In this case, it's ST-20-02989.
And can you take us through kind of what the chain of custody is in terms of receiving blood samples in a case like this?
Sure. So typically, again, what happens is the submitting agency will send it to our laboratory, and there are a number of different ways that it can be submitted. So they can send it through U.S. Postal. They can use one of the courier systems, UPS, FedEx, that type of thing. Sometimes with the local agencies, they'll actually hand deliver it. So any of those systems will work. If it's a state patrol case, we actually have something called campus mail, which is an internal mailing system. But in any case, it does get to us, and at that point, the property and evidence custodians, or PECs, will then take custody. So that's the first signature that will be from our laboratory. They will then take that to a secured vault area that they only have access to, and they'll start taking apart the packaging that the samples are in. And at that point, they will note that with the samples, there's going to be paperwork. And so they will compare the paperwork with the sample to make sure that the names or agency case numbers match. If they don't, they'll make notes about that. They will also make notes as to the type of sample that was received, the approximate volume, as well as the container that the samples were in. So different types of test tubes have different coatings on it, so we have to know that. And at that point, it's assigned an ST number and logged into the system. So every piece of evidence that comes into a laboratory has its own unique barcode.
And in this case, does it indicate who the submitting agency was?
It does.
And who's that?
It is Pierce County Medical Examiner's Office.
Okay. And Washington State Patrol then sent the sample out to another agency, is that right?
Correct. So
can you tell us why and who that
yeah,
was?
sure. So right now we have a fairly significant backlog. So most, if not all, of the medical examiner and coroner's cases are being sent to a outside lab known as NMS. So that's National Medical Services, I believe, is what NMS stands for. But we send them the samples, and then they will process it and then send a final report back to us.
Okay. And is NMS an accredited toxicology lab?
It is. It actually holds the same accreditation as the State Patrol lab does.
Okay, and so in this case, that was done,
Yes,
and the testing was done by NMS?
correct.
And then those results were sent back to Washington State Patrol?
Correct.
And then, and you end up signing on the Washington State Patrol report that includes the NMS report, is that right?
It does. So because the laboratory did not do this testing, what we do is on our report, we say refer to the NMS report, but we don't actually transpose any of the numbers or anything.
Okay. And actually, I probably gave you one exhibit too many of them.
Oh.
Let me take one of those back. So 2583, which has been previously admitted,
Mm-hmm.
can you take a look at that document, please? And if you flip a couple pages in,
Okay.
you'll see the NMS.
Yeah. So it's near the end of this document. Yep.
And is that the NMS report for this case?
It would appear so.
Okay. And is that the same ST number that's indicated in the report that you signed on as well?
So here it says the patient ID is ST-20-02989. So I believe that is the correct number.
Okay. And this is, sorry, I'll hand you back
Thank you.
267 just so you can confirm that.
2989. Yes.
Okay. And what does it indicate there are the levels of methamphetamine? Well, let me ask you this. Does it indicate who the blood sample came from?
It does.
And who's that?
Patient name Ellis, Manuel.
Okay. And what does it indicate that the methamphetamine, or what are the differing substances and levels that are indicated in that report?
Sure. So from the top, we have ephedrine at 19 nanograms per milliliter. The next chemical is phenylpropanolamine, and that is at 39 nanograms per milliliter. The next is amphetamine at 54 nanograms per milliliter. And finally, methamphetamine at 2,400 nanograms per milliliter.
So I want to walk through kind of what those different substances are and kind of your opinion on some of them. So the first substance that's listed there, the ephedrine,
Mm-hmm.
What's the level of that again?
19 nanograms per milliliter.
And what does that tell you, if anything, like about that level and what the drug is?
It would actually probably be easier to go the other way and go from the bottom top.
Let's go from the bottom then.
Okay.
So the first at the bottom, what is the substance and the level?
Okay. So methamphetamine at 2,400 nanograms per milliliter.
Okay. And so what does that tell you?
That at the time of the blood draw, the individual had 2,400 nanograms per milliliter of methamphetamine.
And you previously indicated that the therapeutic levels of testing is 50 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Up to 50 typically, yes.
Up to 50 at the highest for therapeutic.
Typically, yes.
And that what's typically considered a toxic or lethal range is 1,000 nanograms per milliliter.
1,000 and up, yes.
Okay. And this level indicates 2,400 nanograms per milliliter, is that right?
Correct. And again, with the previously stated context provisos.
Sure. So let me ask you this. If an individual has not used methamphetamine for 2 months, and you were to see this level of methamphetamine in their
I would object based on previous motions, and I would ask you to put outside the rest of the jury.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, please excuse us. We'll have this conversation. Everybody can be seated.
Do you want me outside to the court?
Does witness need to step outside?
Yes, well, actually, there may be a blood diary. It's possible I may need a blood diary, but I think Mr. Lewis should step out for the moment.
Okay, Mr. Lewis,
Understood.
please. Thank you very much. Appreciate your patience. Okay, this has to do with Mr. Lewis's qualifications to render an opinion about this?
Well, the foundation of his opinions, because he has admitted in his interview with the defense in the state that he has no knowledge regarding Mr. Ellis. The only role he had in this case was to send out the result of blood sample and receive the results. Now, counsel wants to get into the specific facts of the case regarding tolerance, regarding when Mr. Ellis last used, the amount that was found in his blood, and how Mr. Lewis made conclusions about that, and opinions about that regarding his tolerance. And that's something that's improper. Again, there's no foundation. And in fact, I don't think Mr. Lewis would be able to say, and during his interview, he says it's impossible that the amount that was found in Mr. Ellis could be lethal, but he can't say for certain. He can't render an opinion to a degree of scientific certainty. And there's no foundation for this type of testimony.
Well, this is, well, go ahead and respond. This is a hypothetical question.
Yeah, so, under 703, unfortunately, I only have the 2019 edition, but under 703, hypotheticals are specifically discussed. And so, an expert, I mean, clearly has the qualifications, and an expert can be asked a hypothetical based either, well, it says, an expert can become acquainted with information either by listening to the testimony of other witnesses or by listening to counsel's summary of the testimony in the form of a hypothetical question.
The problem here again is Mr. Lewis was never proffered as an expert witness for the defense. He was a fact witness that handled these tox from M&S Labs, the tox results.
Well, that's a different basis than what you were arguing before. Now you're basically saying you were unprepared for this testimony.
Well,
And as I understand it, it came up at least in an interview
correct,
at which you were present.
correct.
And you were able to ask him about this.
Well, we didn't expect Mr. Conrad to go into this type of analysis with him. He was listed as a fact witness, was going to talk about, we understood what he is.
So you were surprised at the time.
Correct.
But of course, you've known about it now for quite a while,
Certainly, and that's why we made the motion that Mr. Lewis should not be able to opine.
about 2 months ago.
And Your Honor, you made the ruling yesterday that he's permitted to go into this. But again, this is, he's indicated he has no basis, no knowledge about facts. He actually even admitted during his interview that based on just a number alone, he cannot render an opinion without knowing the substance use history, his dosage, his metabolic rate. He has nothing about that. All he has is a number.
Any response? Is that you're shaking your head no, so I assume you mean no?
I guess I'm confused because there's two objections. One, to the fact that he hasn't been noted as an expert. I mean, I don't think I really need to respond to that. We were both present at interviews. The state has been well aware of his testimony and of this information leading up to this case. They're not calling a toxicologist for a reason, and we are. And it's absolutely proper for me to ask him, based on his training experience, whether an individual who has not been using methamphetamine for a period of 2 months, which is based on, like, if I were coming up with some hypothetical that had no application to this case whatsoever, or wasn't grounded in facts of this case, I would completely understand Mr. Liu's objection. But that's not what I'm doing. I'm asking a hypothetical based on the facts of this case, and it's absolutely proper under the rules. And Mr. Liu can go in and say, well, you don't know Mr. Ellis, you don't know, what his tolerance level is, you don't know what, and that's what's typically done, but typically the roles are reversed in the cases I've been involved in. But
During Mr. Lewis's interview, he indicated that he didn't say it was definitive. His opinion was definitive. He said it's possible. And I would ask, Your Honor, to allow the state to dire Mr. Lewis to determine whether he can state with a medical degree or a scientific degree of certainty whether he can render this opinion.
Well, I would be surprised if he could say more probably than not that's what happened to Mr. Ellis. But he may be able to say in general, knowing this much information, I have an opinion. Maybe he won't, I don't know. If you want to voir dire him, that's fine. We'll have him come on in. Welcome back, Mr. Lewis. Council's going to, you can be seated. Council's going to be engaged in a few questions to you, which the lawyers call voir dire, which they
Excellent.
say the same thing about jury selection too. But anyway, so Mr. Liu, go right ahead.
Mr. Lewis, during your interview with the defense and the state, you were asked about whether a person who went cold turkey or hasn't used in 2 or 3 months then has a dosage of 2,400 nanograms per liter, whether that is possibly fatal to them. Are you able to opine to a degree of scientific certainty that this amount is fatal if someone has not used it in that amount of time?
It would be consistent with that, but to this individual, we don't know because we never had the opportunity to test this individual at various levels, obviously not to a lethal level.
But in general, are you able to opine to a scientific degree of certainty?
Well, let's make this clear. More probably than not.
More probably than not, 2,400 nanograms could be lethal.
Again, it'd be expected that it would be at the very least toxic. To this specific individual, we can't tell. But for the general population, it would be at the very least, we would expect toxic effects.
Do you hold that opinion to a scientific degree of certainty?
That's more probably than not.
Again, that is what the literature that's what the literature would indicate, is that this would be at least toxic level. I can't say that it's going to be lethal for this individual because we don't have that luxury of testing this specific individual.
What literature would that?
So the general literature, there's what you good? Okay. When I'm giving testimony, it is not to one specific paper because that is one data point. So what I do when I'm reviewing scientific literature is I'm looking for consistencies, I'm looking for patterns. So whereas if you have a paper that indicates that there was a case that was presented where a individual was presented to the emergency room and ultimately died, and this was the concentration with admission blood. So at the time that the person was presented to the emergency room, that is one data point, right? So with that one data point, there is still a lot of context that we don't know. So is this person a first-time user, or is this person a individual that has greater history with whatever the compound is? So it is one data point. So if we then have a number of data points, that we can start seeing general trends. So I know from our lab that we have individuals that, without knowing what the context of their tolerance is, that can have this concentration or even higher and still be contacted by officers because of poor driving. I've also seen death cases where the concentration is a tenth of this, and they're deceased. So again, we're looking for general trends. So back to your question, given a number, can I tell if this person is alive or dead? Absolutely not.
Because all you have is a number.
Correct.
But as far as whether you can opine someone who has not used in 2 to 3 months, and whether that amount is possibly toxic to that person or lethal to that person, are you able to make that determination on a more probable basis?
So again, if the person has lost their tolerance, and again, this is a whole different discussion as to what this person's history with the compound is, what their last dosing was, all that, or what their usual dosing is when they are actually dosing. After a certain amount of time, so greater than 2 days or 3 days, I would say that if they have stopped taking the dosing, then their tolerance is going to start coming down. Now, there is no hard and fast rule that says, oh, at 10 days they've lost their tolerance, or at 20 days, or what have you. So after 2 or 3 months, again, it's a fairly large time frame, so I would expect that person to at least lose a significant portion of their tolerance, maybe not all of it, but a significant portion, which again goes back to what was the dosing when they stopped.
So you would have to know the use history of that person in order to render this opinion.
It would be another piece of the puzzle. So the more pieces of the puzzle that we have, the better of an opinion that we could.
Here, you know nothing about Mr. Ellis's use.
Correct.
At all. What his usual dosage is, how frequently he uses.
Correct.
And you know nothing about what his usage was in the days leading up to this incident.
That is correct.
And you've actually also indicated that you just simply can't determine how, when a person loses their tolerance. Is that correct?
Correct.
Nothing further, Your Honor. There's no base, no foundation for this.
Any questions for Mr. Lewis? For this purpose?
I guess just a couple follow-up questions. Mr. Lewis, again, taking into account, how many tests have you done in coroner cases involving methamphetamine?
Including the ones up in British Columbia? Probably a couple hundred, maybe 1,000.
Okay. And where does this level fall within the cases that you've seen?
For coroner's cases, probably on the higher side.
Okay. And in terms of opining as to lethality or toxicity, if an individual, and we're talking about general population,
Mm-hmm.
an individual has not been using methamphetamine for 3 months or 2 months, and you were to see this level, you would expect it to be a lethal or toxic dose.
It would be consistent with it being at least the toxic dose. Actually, would you mind if I use the whiteboard real quick? It might make things a little more comprehensible.
Sure. I want to show you one thing quickly.
Mhm.
And this is Exhibit 2579. So 2579 is a transcript of your
Yep.
interview with us. You remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And that was August 25th, 2023.
Correct.
And Mr. Lou's present for that interview as well.
Yep.
And you were actually asked in the interview, if you see on line 7, hypothetically,
Mhm.
the individual had not been using methamphetamine.
Page 22.
Sorry, page 22. Hypothetically, an individual had not been using methamphetamine for 3 months, and then took a dose to where the level was 2,400 nanograms per milliliter.
Right.
Per milliliter.
Mhm.
Anything would you expect from that?
Mhm.
And your answer was, I would expect, if it's 3 months, I would expect it to be a lethal dose to that individual.
Right.
Is that still your opinion?
It is. So again, at least toxic, if not lethal.
Okay. And you base that opinion based on your training and experience in this field,
Correct.
and on a more probable than not basis, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Lewis, in that same interview, and I direct your attention to page 21, line 17, you're asked if they go cold turkey and go, actually your answer was, the question to you was regarding tolerance. How long would the tolerance of an individual last? Do you see that?
Yes.
And your answer was, it goes back to how often they will use the drug. So if they're using it pretty consistently, they will be dosing to their feel-good level. Did I read that correctly?
Correct.
So if the problem becomes that if they are taking a compound, and I don't care what it is, if they're taking a compound and they're taking it fairly consistently, then their body can adapt to that. Did I read that correctly?
Correct.
But if they go cold turkey or go away for a week or a month or something like that, and then try going right back to it, that level would be fatal to them. So, and then you said, as far as, so we see this more often as sort of an opiates, where, someone's been taking heroin for a long time, and then they kick the habit, and then something triggers them, and they go back to taking what they need to be their dose. Did I read that correctly?
Correct. Yes.
And because the body's lost the tolerance, they end up, dying. So I don't know if that's necessarily the same thing with stimulants. You see that?
Correct.
And methamphetamine is a stimulant.
Correct. Yep.
And you said, I don't know that. Again, the body does accommodate for doses, but I don't know how long it takes for them to lose that.
Correct.
Okay. So your knowledge applies to opiates, not necessarily stimulants.
No, so the concept of tolerance, regardless of the class of drugs, is the same. So, again, if I could use the board.
Well, I actually did
Why don't we let him do
Sure,
that?
please.
Continue your questioning. Because it's apparently something he's trying to let us know on. So let's let him educate us. Is there a marker?
I believe so.
Great.
Thanks. All right. So on the x-axis we have time, on the y-axis we have concentration. So when an individual, and I'm going to use for medicinal purposes. Okay, so when the person is first dosed with compound X to alleviate their symptoms Y. Okay, what's going to happen is over time they're going to take that dose, it's going to go up and it's going to come down. Then let's say that the doctor says you should be taking this 3 times a day. So first period ends and then it goes up again because they've taken their second dose, and then the concentration of that chemical starts going down again. And then they take their third dose, and over time what's going to happen is it actually starts doing this. It maintains a certain concentration. So this concentration, where it cuts through the flat line, is what's called the therapeutic dose. So here you have what's called the trough level. So this is just before they take the next dose. And then depending on the compound, depending on the formulation, let's say it takes about 2 to 3 hours to get fully absorbed into that person's system. This is what's called the peak level. And then because there's no more drug going into the system, it starts decreasing until the next dosage is due. Again, trough level. So here we have a fairly tight range. And at this point, because it's a constant value, a constant concentration in that person's system, the body then can accommodate for any of the unwanted situations or unwanted symptoms. So again, as a useful example for people that are taking opiate class drugs, what's going to happen is when they first take it, they're going to feel the unwanted side effects. So they're going to be sleepy, they're going to be very lethargic, they're going to be slow to react. But what they're prescribed the drug for is pain management, so they will feel some relief here. And then when they get here, again, the body will then say, okay, I'm being lethargic, I'm being sleepy, but the pain is managed. And at this concentration, what's going to happen is because it's a constant concentration, the body is going to be able to compensate for the symptoms that it doesn't want. So it's not going to be sleepy anymore, it's not going to be lethargic, but the management of that pain is being achieved. So, having said that, and that's tolerance. So, similar graph as before. So, x-axis we have time, y-axis we have concentration. If the person is tolerant to a concentration, again we're doing this along the way. So we have the peak concentrations, we have the trough, and let's say they miss a dose. Okay, so instead of stopping at the trough, it's going to dip down. Now, if they then take the dose again, it's going to come back up. If, however, and again, it varies for different drugs, but if they come back up and then they stop cold turkey, as it were, we are getting no more of this compound into that person's system. So it starts dropping like this, and it leaves the system. So what happens is, if it is an extended period of time, that body is losing the ability to compensate for any of the unwanted side effects. And then what happens is, if they go back to a dosing that they left, that body has lost all that compensation ability, in which case the unwanted side effects are definitely going to come back, and if it's a high enough dose, it's actually going to affect all the neurotransmitters, and the body has no idea what to do with that, in which case then you're going to see the unwanted side effects at an extreme level. So that's when you get the toxic side effects, and if it is a high enough concentration, it could be lethal.
You provided this explanation with regard to pain-managed opiates,
Right, right.
Okay.
So this also does affect stimulant class drugs. So when a person is prescribed a stimulant class drugs, such as, let's say, amphetamine or Adderall for ADD or ADHD, for the first little while, that person is going to have all the unwanted side effects. So they may be, that heart rate may increase, they may lose the ability to salivate, all these. But again, going back to the previous graph, paper cut. Again, the concentration in that individual is going to follow this kind of behavior for the first little while until that concentration of Adderall, as an example, is going to normalize, in which case then you're going to have a very tight range, and then all the unwanted side effects, so again, that increased heart rate, all the rest of that stuff is going to go back to what would be considered normal for that individual. So instead of having, let's say, when they start getting dosed, their heart rate without the drug is, let's say, 60 beats a minute. when we start dosing them, it may go up to 80 or it may go up to 100. But at some point in time, when that person becomes tolerant, that heart rate is going to come back to 60 beats per minute. So, going back to graph 2. 60, 60, 60, and then, so here, the person is, for all intents and purposes, considered functionally normally, because they built up tolerance to drug. If they go off that drug, then they may oversalivate because the body's trying to compensate for something that's not there anymore. And then if in the circumstance where we are going right back to this dose without having that stepwise, going back to graph 1.
Let me just,
Sure.
Your knowledge of this is based primarily on your knowledge of opiates. Is that accurate to say?
No, this is for all drugs again.
Well, during your interview, you said, so I don't know if this is necessarily the same thing with stimulants. I mean, you were talking about...
For the time frames. But yes, we would expect this for all drugs because every drug is given to you for a reason. If you're taking it medicinally, it's there to compensate for something. So again, I don't know what the time frame is for methamphetamine. Does it disappear in a week? Does it disappear in 3 weeks? Does it disappear in a month? We don't know.
Kind of, this is a product of the metabolic processes of an individual human being.
Correct. For the general population.
So, for instance, in the alcohol situation, we see quite commonly, we use the, I don't know what they call it anymore, the BAC verifier, whatever it's called.
Data master used to be it, now it's the Draeger thing.
There you go. But the science of that is that alcohol metabolizes in general in people at a certain rate.
Correct.
That metabolic processes produces certain chemicals in the lungs,
Possibly, yes.
and that at a certain rate, and then that gets breathed into a device, which then measures what that secondary metabolic process is as alcohol is being metabolized, right? Because it's not unless you have a blood test, it's not reading the blood alcohol content directly, right?
Correct. So in breath testing,
Yeah.
it actually is, a lot of the ethanol actually does get released into the
Well,
air.
that could be some of it too.
Yeah.
But that's at least the idea of the machine.
Correct, is to test and measure the concentration of either ethanol or whatever
Right.
is set up
And
specifically.
it assumes a certain relatively regular metabolic process in human beings for alcohol,
Correct.
which may differ from one human to the next to some extent.
To a certain extent, the rate is. So the one sort of interesting with alcohol, and I know we're kind of getting off, is so time and concentration again. So do we have another color by chance?
Probably.
I'll just do a dotted line.
Okay, go ahead.
So for alcohol, we have this kind of curve where we have very much like any consumed or exposure. It starts at 0, and that's time 0. It goes up, and then it is going to reach a peak where we're not adding any more chemical. And then for alcohol,
In other words, we've stopped drinking somewhere along that line.
correct. So here we stop drinking. So at the peak concentration, it's approximately 1 hour. After that, assuming that we don't redose, this area of the curve here, the elimination curve, is actually what's called 0 order. So this is why we can do retrograde extrapolation, because this is, we can actually determine rise over run, because regardless of the concentration, this is more or less a straight line. For drugs, we don't have this luxury.
But the reason why it declines like that is because we know humans metabolize alcohol at a reasonably predictable rate.
Correct.
So as an example as another little side bit of this is, when somebody dies, the metabolic processes stop.
Correct.
So if you take their blood at that point in time, as opposed to they go to the hospital, they linger there for some hours and then die,
Right.
and you take the blood then,
Right.
you may not have an accurate determination of what their blood alcohol or whatever the substance we're talking about,
Yep.
what it was at the time of an event, as opposed to at the time the blood was taken.
Correct. So yeah, so in your example, if we have a individual that, let's say, unfortunately passes at a car accident, so we know that that is the snapshot of the, in this case, blood alcohol at the time of the accident.
And
If,
it-
however, going to your second, if the person is in an accident, and then so let's say that their concentration is up here, if we wait enough time, that person is still metabolizing. So when we get that sample of blood, it may be down here somewhere.
Right. But let me ask you this. I mean, with alcohol in general, you're going to have, you would have ordinarily have metabolized almost all the alcohol in a period of an hour, of a day, right? 24 hours or
Yes,
something.
yes.
But when we think of tolerance with respect to alcohol, for instance, are we talking about something else that is not nothing that has nothing to do necessarily with the remaining amount of alcohol in the system after a day, for instance?
To a certain, yes.
In other words, if somebody's is a regular drinker of alcohol and they drink on Sunday and then they don't drink again until Thursday, and this is a habit with them, they've been doing this for years,
Right.
they can still develop a certain tolerance, so they can drink more on Thursday than they could have a year before, say.
Right. So.
So what has explained that when the
Sure.
when the system when the chemical has completely left the body?
Sure. So what happens with tolerance? One of the other things too is that it can actually induce an increased level of enzymes to basically prepare for whatever that chemical insult is. So in your case with the alcohol, if we have an individual that maybe drinks a glass of wine on Saturday, the native concentration of enzymes in that person's liver is probably going to be enough to handle that one glass of wine without increasing the enzymes. However, in the case where the person is, let's say, a binge drinker, so they're taking a fair amount of alcohol in, and they do it Sunday, Thursday, as your example, on a regular basis, then the body is going to be prepared for that dose, in which case they're going to actually increase the amount of enzymes that are in the liver in preparation of that. And so for that circumstance, unlike the one here, this type of tolerance, again, is for medical purposes. So here we're looking for a specific behavior that the doctor wants to have in that individual.
Right.
So for opiates as an example, pain management, for stimulants as an example, to control ADHD, or for narcolepsy to make sure that they stay awake during the typical approximately 16 to 18 hours that we're working. For individuals that are using a chemical off-label, so not for medicinal purposes, they're actually seeking some sort of behavior that is not necessarily medical.
Right, they're trying to get high. Right.
For lack of a better description, yes.
Well,
So in
but
which case, if the body has built in any fail-safes, if you will, to compensate for that higher concentration, they're going to try, that individual is trying to overwhelm that system to, again, get that behavior that they're seeking.
so in a case of our alcoholic, they want to drink enough more to compensate for the additional enzyme activity.
Correct.
But you're saying this additional enzyme activity that it may happen on now Thursdays, the body sort of reacts to this idea that every 3 or 4 days we're going to get another big dose of this.
Correct.
So then it compensates for it in some way.
Correct.
But you're saying at some point in time, if they miss several weeks or months, at some point in time, then that liver enzyme, for instance, will quit reacting.
Right, because the body now sees it as essentially they can divert energy to do something else instead of maintaining these systems.
Right. So now when they go back to drinking as much as they used to drink on Thursdays, it's going to have bigger effect.
Correct. In which case, again, with depressants, it activates different areas of the brain, in which case it's going to overwhelm that. And for the case of depressants, it could cause sleepiness, could cause sleepiness, and it could cause actually decrease in heart rate, decrease in breathing,
Sure.
that type of thing.
Well, to get back to Mr. Lou's point there, and just I used alcohol in some sense because I wanted to sort of take it away from this, but also because I have some better understanding of how that works. So his point about is there a different sort of enzyme recovery, if you will, in the liver, with compared to alcohol, compared to opiates, compared to amphetamines? See what I mean?
Yes.
And if so, do we have any rough idea what that might be?
Right.
Or do we certainly know that no matter what, even if they're a little bit different in the near term, at 30 days or 60 days, no matter what it is, it's not a problem anymore?
So
Or
unfortunately,
it is a problem.
right. So unfortunately, depending on the drug, so this is the other thing that I was going to get back to you since you had brought up alcohol. To number 3. So here again with the dotted line, we have the intake of the chemical, in this case alcohol, reaches the peak, and here we have a zero-order kinetic elimination. This is only true for alcohol. For all other drugs, regardless of methamphetamine, regardless of opiates, benzodiazepines, what's going to happen is, and I'm going to offset it a little bit so that we can actually see, but it's going to go up, and it does this behavior. So here we have still the absorption, and then it's going to reach the peak, and then during the elimination phase, this is called first-order kinetics. So it is essentially dependent on half-lives. And what half-lives mean is that depending on the chemical, depending on, especially if we're talking in a person, the genetic makeup, there can be other factors as well that affect how fast a drug is eliminated. A half-life just tells us that if a chemical takes, let's say, 6 hours to eliminate half of the dose, so peak concentration at 6 hours, we expect 50% of that dose to be left. 6 hours after that, half of that dose is gone, so now we're down to a quarter of the original dose. 6 hours after that, another half of that is gone, so it goes from 1 to a half to a quarter, 8, 16, 32, etc. So this is where, again, if we start losing the chemical out of the system, then if it's long enough, then the body does not see any need for maintaining that enzyme system, in which case that's where you start losing the tolerance. Does that help?
Any further questions?
I have no further questions.
Any further questions?
So the amount here in this case, the so the amphetamine amount that's 54 nanograms per
Oh. Yeah, so going to 2583.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, let me just ask you this: based on the different substances that you have there and the levels that you have there, would this be consistent with an individual that had used methamphetamine 3 days prior?
Based just on the numbers, I would say probably not.
Why not?
So, again, this is just a snapshot in time, but when amphetamine,
Don't worry, doctor, we're going to let you repeat all this later.
not a doctor,
Oh, sorry.
not a doctor,
Oh, I thought you had a PhD. I'm sorry.
not even that, just a bachelor.
Well, Mr.
All right.
We're going to make you say this all again in front of the jury,
That's
probably,
fine.
or at least some of it.
Sorry, I forgot where we left off.
Oh,
Sorry, that's right.
the
So-
question about can you tell whether or not this person used
Yep.
within 3 days, let's say, I think was the question.
So, generic curves. When a person is dosed with a compound, what we expect to see again is it goes up, reaches the peak, and then it goes down, and it gets metabolized and broken down. So, if, however, we're measuring the metabolite as well. In this case, we have amphetamine as a metabolite. What happens is, over a period of time, as the methamphetamine is absorbed, the body recognizes a foreign substance and tries to manipulate it, so it can add groups, subtract groups, conjugate it, that type of thing. So adding big groups and make it more water soluble, so it gets eliminated through the urine and feces. What we're going to see is that at some point in time, we're going to see an increase of rise of, in this case, amphetamine, because it is the major metabolic breakdown, major metabolite of methamphetamine. So if the person had been using fairly recently, then what we would expect to see is a concentration of amphetamine. Here we have a fairly large discrepancy between the two. So it is, again, without saying that it is not consistent with having recent usage.
Not consistent
Not
with what?
having recent use. So like 3 days where we actually have time to actually build up the amphetamine.
Oh, so not consistent with 3 days, with having used 3 days prior?
Right.
Okay.
Because again, we would expect to see some amphetamine in that person's system.
So would it be, so since the metabolite is much lower than the methamphetamine level, it indicates that it's been recently used that day?
Again, I can't give you the time frame, but it is more consistent with having more recent than, rather than an extended period of time.
Okay, got it.
All right, anything else?
No, Judge.
Mr. Liu?
Mr. Lewis, didn't you say earlier in the interview that to try to determine based on the amphetamine amounts and meth amounts
Yes,
when the last usage was?
Exactly.
Literally stabbed in the dark.
absolutely, right.
Okay.
So, again, I cannot tell you, like, was it 3 days ago, was it, whatever, but the concentration is inconsistent with having an extended period of time. What that exact period of time is, I can't tell you.
Let me ask one follow-up. So if an individual had used 3 days, say, so this test result, the blood sample was taken March 3rd, say they had used 3 days prior and then not used, they wouldn't have any methamphetamine or amphetamine in their system at those levels, right?
That would go back to what the dosing was.
Well, what's the half-life of methamphetamine?
Again, a number of different factors come into play, but I believe the published range is anywhere from about 6 hours up to about 15 hours, I believe.
So 15 hours.
So every 15 hours, we lose half of that dose.
You lose half the dose.
Right.
And then you'd see a much larger breakdown of the metabolites.
You would expect it.
Okay. And then after 15 hours, so if you did it, if you looked another 15 hours ahead, so say 30 hours, that would the whole amount dissipate at that point then?
No, half of it would be gone. That's a half-life.
15 hours is half-life.
Right, so let's call it 12 hours for ease of calculation. So at noon today, if we dosed an individual with 1 unit of compound X, 12 hours from now, we would expect half of compound X to be still in that person's system.
And I guess my question is, another 12 hours from that point.
Would be down to a quarter of the dosing.
Okay.
Okay, so you lose 50% of whatever's left in that person's system every 12 hours.
Got it.
Which is why I said earlier, you start off at 1, go to half, go to a quarter, go to a 16th, 32, et cetera, a half, if my math is right.
Okay. Okay.
All right,
So 50%
well,
of 50% of 50% of 50%.
I'm going to allow the testimony. We'll take a break. Let the jury know. We'll be a break for 15 minutes. Thank you. Continue, Mr. Conrad.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Lewis, I was asking you about the levels that are present, and the level of 2,400 nanograms per milliliter is present in Mr. Ellis's, but I want to ask you a hypothetical. And I want to ask you that if an individual has not used methamphetamine for a period of 2 to 3 months, and you were to see this level of 2,400 nanograms, what would you expect?
So again, speaking for the general population, a dose like this, we would expect to have toxic, if not lethal, effects.
Okay. And you talked to us a bit about tolerance.
Mhm.
And I want to go a bit more into, well, let me ask you this actually, back up for a second. Toxic effects. What would be toxic effects?
So when an individual is introduced to chemical, be it a drug, be it what have you, whether it's used for medical or off-label usage, there is going to be, when the person is dosed with it, there is going to be some sort of biochemical effect. Now, is that effect going to be large enough to observe or not? We don't know. So at low doses, if we measure the biochemical, like the enzyme activity, there's going to be a change from pre-dosing to post-dosing. But does that translate to something that is going to be observed? We don't know. As the dosage gets higher, the observable behavior are going to become more apparent. So if we, as an example, take alcohol. If I give you a thimbleful of de-alcoholized beer, it still has ethanol in it. And if we measure the liver enzymes, there's going to be an increase in activity. But are we going to see the flushed face? Are we going to see the inability to coordinate activities, that type of thing? Probably not. Okay? If we, however, go to a regular bottle of beer, so one standard drink, we're going to see some more activity in the enzyme system, of course. But we may also see the flushed face. We may also see some of the other typical symptoms that we see when someone has drank a beer. If that person now drinks 3 or 4 beers, are the symptoms we expect would be even greater. So we might be able at that point to hear slurred speech. We might be seeing the flushed face, that type of thing. When we talk about different chemicals and their toxic or lethal effects, essentially it's adding on to what becomes baseline, and it just gets more and more observable the higher the dose becomes.
Okay. And in terms of what's considered a lethal amount of methamphetamine, and you talked about 1,000 nanograms per milliliter. How does a person's underlying, let me ask you this, how does a person's any underlying disease affect what that level is as well?
So it would depend on the disease. So if the person, so when an individual is dosed with a chemical, the body will recognize that as a foreign substance and begin to try to break it down. So again, depending on the disease, if that disease encompasses the ability to break that compound down, then that compound is going to stay in the system longer. Or to the flip side, if for some strange reason it increases the binding or the elimination of that compound, then that drug is not going to be in that system for what would be considered a normal period.
If an individual has an underlying heart condition, could that lower the amount that could be potentially lethal for them in terms of methamphetamine?
It's possible.
Okay. And lower than what, 1,000 nanograms?
Potentially.
And I also also want to ask you about, we talked yesterday a bit about tolerance,
Mhm.
and I want to ask you, would it be helpful to use a chart in front of the jury to explain this idea of tolerance?
I believe it would.
And Judge, would that be proper for him to come down and explain the tolerance?
Certainly. Thank you.
Okay, understood. This is Exhibit 2751. Okay, can you walk us through
Sure.
and explain to us again this idea, the
Sure.
concept of tolerance?
Everyone see this okay? Okay. So when we're talking about tolerance, what we're looking for, again, going back to the explanation yesterday that when a system is challenged with a certain level of stimulus, there's going to be a certain level of reaction. But over time, given that same level of stimulus, the reaction is going to decrease. So on the x-axis, we have time. On the y-axis, we have concentration. When someone is given a new medication, we're going to assume that they don't have any of the compound X in their system at the time. So what's going to happen is they take their first dose, and it's going to go up, and then it's going to reach the peak concentration, and that's going to start coming down a little bit because the body is starting to metabolize that compound and get it out of the system. So let's say that we are taking a medication that is prescribed by a doctor, and the doctor says that we should be taking this every, let's say, 8 hours. So at the when we first take it, it's going to go up, and the peak is probably going to be around 2 to 3 hours, and then it's going to start coming down, and then we take our next dose, and it's going to go up again, and then it's going to start coming down. Okay, and then we take our third dose, and then again, behavior is going to be approximately the same. It's going to go up and come down. So I don't know if it's going to be 3 doses or if it's going to be 6 doses, but at some point in time, the amount that is going into the system and the amount that is getting eliminated in that 8-hour period is going to start doing this. So what we know is here is the concentration in that person's system doesn't vary greatly. So that is what is considered the therapeutic dose for that individual for this drug. Okay, so this, medically speaking, is what the doctor is looking for is for some sort of behavior that that drug will give to the individual to benefit that individual. So as an example, for opiates, so for oxycodone, someone's hurt their back. The doctor prescribes oxycodone, probably not anymore, but oxycodone is going to go up, come down, and at some point in time, it's going to become what's called steady state. So this concentration, this line here, is the steady state concentration. The highest level is called the peak concentration, and the lowest level, just before the patient takes the next dosage, is called the trough. So there is going to be, again, the steady state concentration, and then peak level, trough level. So that is going to stay, that sort of defines the therapeutic range for that individual. That answer the question?
Yeah.
So for tolerance, once that person becomes quote unquote steady state, the drugs may have unwanted side effects. So again, going back to the oxycodone example, if when the first person is, or the first time the person is dosed, what we'll probably find is that the unwanted side effects are going to play a fairly major part, in which case the person's going to be somewhat sleepy, be lethargic, can't really do a lot because they're falling asleep. Again, but at some point in time, they're going to reach the steady state, at which point the body now recognizes that there's going to be a certain concentration in that system at all times, and then can actually fight the unwanted side effects. So that at this point, when they're at steady state, they're not going to be lethargic. They're not going to be falling asleep all the time. But what we're using it for, what the doctor is prescribing it for pain management, is still going to be achieved. So that's when tolerance comes into play, is that we don't have any of the unwanted side effects, but the medicinal use for this chemical is being achieved.
And let me ask you a couple clarifying questions. So, and this requires consistent use over a period of time.
Correct.
And can you give us a diagram of what happens when an individual doesn't use for a period of time?
Sure. So, did you want to
Yeah,
mark
you can
this?
flip it.
Okay.
This will all be one.
Okay. So again, x-axis we have time, y-axis we have concentration, so just like the last one. So here, if the person is in their steady state, and for whatever reason, they miss a dose. So here, instead of stopping at the trough level, it goes beyond that trough level and is still being eliminated from the body. So at this point, if they take, they start losing the concentration, and if they then go back to taking a dose, they're going to have that stepwise, and then come back to steady state.
And if they don't use for a longer period of time?
Sure. So if they stop completely, then again, what's going to happen is we're going to see that kind of behavior where you have no chemical coming into the system, but the body is still recognizes a foreign substance, and it just continues to eliminate it from the system. So over time, if we can follow it in their blood concentration, you're going to see a decrease.
And so if an individual hasn't used for a period of time, let's say 2 months,
Okay.
and then they go back to using again, what happens to the concentration and the effect?
Sure. So if they go right back to where they had left, obviously depending on the concentration, if the person's system has essentially shut down the metabolic engines to compensate for that, then you're going to see a lot of unwanted side effects coming back, potentially. Again, concentration dependent. So what's going to happen is you're going to go whoop, and then you're going to try to maintain that, well, let's see, you're going to see all the little steps. So this isn't going to be, hopefully they're not just going right back to whatever that concentration was. If they, again, under the watchfulness of a doctor, they'll probably say, let's start taking those small steps again. But if they don't have that luxury and they just go back and they have that very high dose, then the body has lost that ability to compensate for the unwanted side effects, in which case that person could be showing signs and symptoms of an overdose. So the effects are going to be magnified, in which case if the levels are high enough and the body reacts poorly to it, it could become toxic or lethal to that individual.
And I want to ask you a couple more questions.
Mhm.
In this case, the 24, well, let me ask you this. You work for the coroner's office in British Columbia, and now you do work for a coroner's office throughout Washington State as well, right?
That's part of the job, yes.
Okay. And
Can I put this way, or?
I'm going to ask you one other question about metabolites that I think will be helpful.
Mhm.
And the concentration of 2,400 nanograms per milliliter of methamphetamine in this case,
So no,
where does that fall in terms of the ranges of substances that you see in coroner cases?
for methamphetamine, or?
Correct.
Okay. So generally speaking, and again, context, it is on the higher side.
Okay. And how many cases do you think you've looked at?
In total, for
Ballpark.
a couple of mid-thousands.
Okay. So the next thing I wanted to ask is if you could help us, help the jury. You've explained to us the idea of methamphetamines and metabolites and the breakdown of those.
Sure. again, we are using the time versus concentration axes, and counselors indicated that if a individual is given a dose of a chemical, again, we're going to see that increase in the dose, and then we're going to see it peter off because there's no more coming in, and so we have an equilibrium of absorption versus elimination, at which point we're going to see this kind of behavior. So this is for the parent compound, in this case methamphetamine. The breakdown product is amphetamine. So, sorry, terrible curve. So what happens is, assuming that the system is naive before dosing, what we're going to see is again this methamphetamine and decrease. So I'm going to call this parent. Now, as it breaks down, assuming that you're trying to monitor the breakdown products as well, what we're going to see is over time, not to scale, the metabolite or the daughter compound is going to start, is going to follow obviously the introduction of the parent. So this is the source material, and then this is the breakdown material. So there's going to be essentially two waves that are going to come through. So here we have, again, the parent, and then at some point in time later, the metabolite is going to increase, and the wave is going to follow fairly similar to the parent.
And so in this case, the parent would be methamphetamine,
Correct.
and the metabolite would be amphetamine.
Correct.
Okay. And then, so what's the amphetamine level in this case is 54 nanograms per milliliter,
Correct.
and the methamphetamine obviously 2,400 nanograms per milliliter.
Correct.
So what does it tell you that it's a low amphetamine level compared to the parent level?
So given the scenario that we have here, that the parent compound is going to be somewhere here, and the amphetamine possibly has not had a chance to actually develop.
Okay. Because if it's later on in time, if it's had time to develop, you would see a higher level of the metabolite amphetamine as compared to the parent methamphetamine.
You would expect that.
Okay. So, and what's the half-life for methamphetamine?
Okay. Time concentration is getting work up today. So for half-lives. So when a compound is introduced into the individual, what's going to happen is it's going to go up, reach the peak, and then it's actually going to have this kind of behavior. So it's not a straight line behavior. This is actually a curve. So this is what's called first order kinetics. And what happens is with half-lives is different chemicals will be eliminated from the body in given a certain time. So for methamphetamine, memory serves, the half-life, the approximate half-life is approximately 10 hours. So I'm going to call it 12 just for ease of calculation. So get one half-life, whatever this dose is, and let's call this peak concentration 1 unit. Okay, so after 12 hours, 50% of that dose is gone. So we're down to 50%. 12 hours after that, another 50% of what's remaining is gone. So now we're going from 1 to 50 to 25, and then another half-life later, half of that is going to be gone, so we're down to 12.5%. So assuming, again, single dose, we have the peak concentration, and then every, in this case, 12 hours, 50% is going to be eliminated.
Okay, and then that'll continue until obviously the substance is completely eliminated.
Correct.
Okay, so within 12 hours, roughly 12 hours, half of the methamphetamine concentration would be gone.
Correct.
And then from that point, half of a half, and so
Correct.
on and so forth.
So every 12 hours, you're going to lose 50% of what's left.
Okay.
there was two, I think you already gave him the one, this is now 2750. 252, and then 53.
752, 53, 54.
Okay. Two- 2751, 2752, 2753, and 2754. And we'll get those placed on those. They haven't been admitted, I'm just marking them so we know what they are.
Should I have a date and initial, or
It's up to you.
could you put the date and initial on it, please?
Or do you want me to run over there?
Couple additional questions. You told us yesterday that you testified in about 500 cases, is that right?
Correct.
And you work for the Washington State Toxicology Lab.
State Patrol Toxicology Lab.
State Patrol Toxicology Lab. And about how many of the times, 500 times, have you been called by the defense?
Subpoenaed by the defense probably a handful of times, so maybe a dozen.
And testified for the defense?
Well, again, we don't testify for anyone, we testify to our findings. So regardless of who subpoenas us, we still show up.
Okay, and sorry. Thank you for clarifying. So how many times has the defense requested that you testify?
Again, probably about a dozen times.
So a dozen out of the 500 times.
Correct.
And what you just said about testifying to your findings, you're not being paid by you're being paid by the state of Washington.
Correct.
That's your salary.
Yes.
Okay. You haven't been paid by, you're not a paid expert by the defense or anything like that?
No.
And you previously did a interview in this case in August of 2023 this year?
Yes.
And at that interview, prosecutors from the Attorney General's office were there?
I believe so, yes.
And during that interview, you also discussed your opinion regarding the hypothetical if an individual had not been using methamphetamine in a 2 to 3 month period of time, and had 2,400 nanograms of methamphetamine in their system, what the result, what you would expect in terms of result. You were asked that question.
Yes.
And your response there was that you would
Your
think,
Honor, it's been asked and answered.
Overruled on that basis.
and your response there was that you would consider it a lethal result, right?
Correct. At the very least, it's going to be toxic, but it's high enough that we could include lethality as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Lee, you can proceed. I'm going to cut you off about 5 minutes because I've got a meeting that I'm supposed to chair, and it's going to be on Zoom, but it's going to be in the courtroom, so I need to clear all you out and so I can get that started by noon. So, but obviously when you're not, you won't be done, and we'll come back to you at 1:30. So go right ahead.
Before we start, I have this piece. There you go. Thanks.
Mr. Lewis, good morning.
Good morning.
Almost afternoon. Now, Mr. Lewis, you did not perform any testing in this case, is that correct?
That is correct.
And the blood sample itself, as I believe you indicated, was tested by an outside lab, is that correct?
Correct. NMS Labs.
Okay. And you never spoke to the forensic
Toxicologist?
toxicologist that performed the testing of the blood, correct?
That is correct.
In fact, your role in this case involved sending the blood out to the lab and receiving the results back.
Correct. So the laboratory sent acted essentially as a relay station, sent the sample out to NMS Labs, and then when the report came back, this was one that I had processed for final report.
Okay. And after receiving the report, you checked for the identification number, is that correct?
Correct. So make sure that the ST number that we mentioned earlier, so our internal tracking number, as well as the name, match the paperwork.
And then you prepared a brief report regarding receipt of the results.
Correct.
And then you, I believe, indicated you kicked it up for administrative review.
Right. So every report has to have at least 2 people, the final report. So the primary analyst, in which case this was me, who's responsible for doing the preliminary work on the case. And then when the case is completed, that will go to at least a supervisory level review to make sure that all the testing that needs to be done for that case is done. As well, they will make sure, again, the ST number is correct, the agency number is also correct, and the spelling of the name is correct, or if there are any discrepancies, those will be noted on the report.
And that is, and you would agree that your role in this case is limited to that, right?
Absolutely.
And so, in fact, during your interview with the defense and the state, you didn't have firsthand knowledge or didn't have recollection of this case?
Correct.
Okay. You would agree that there is a large variance in how meth affects individuals, correct?
To a certain extent.
Okay. There are a number of factors involved, is that correct?
Absolutely.
And you agree that people metabolize methamphetamine differently, correct?
To a certain extent.
You would agree that the effect methamphetamine may have on an individual would depend on the person's history with the drug, correct?
Yes.
And you would agree that it would be difficult to determine the effect of meth on any particular person based on just a number, correct?
Correct.
And that number here being the blood concentration level, correct?
Correct.
And you would agree that if you don't know the history of a person, all you can tell us is what the person's drug concentration is, correct?
At the time of the blood draw.
At the time of the blood draw. And that's what we have in this case, right?
Correct.
And just given a blood concentration value, you wouldn't be able to determine whether a person is functional, walking or talking, or whether that person is deceased, correct?
Let her catch up.
I'm sorry?
We'll let her catch up.
Okay.
Correct. That your observations are correct.
And you would agree that there is no minimum maximum amount of meth that anyone can say will definitively cause death, correct?
Correct.
And whether any amount of meth is toxic depends on the individual, correct?
To a certain extent, yes.
And here you know nothing about Mr. Ellis's drug history, correct?
That is correct.
You don't know how many years he has used meth, correct?
That is correct.
And you know nothing about what Mr. Ellis's usual meth dosage is, correct?
That is correct.
And you know nothing about his medical history, correct?
That is correct.
And you also know nothing about Mr. Ellis's tolerance to meth, is that correct?
That is correct.
And you don't know whether he was using meth in the days leading up to the incident, correct?
That is correct as well.
And you don't know whether he was using in the weeks or month leading up to the incident, correct?
Correct.
In fact, you acknowledge that you can't determine how long, with regard to tolerance, and whether someone loses tolerance. You've testified, or you actually indicated that you can't determine how long it takes someone to lose tolerance, correct?
Correct, because we don't have the context. So if, as counsel has indicated, if this person is a first-time user, then we'd expect no tolerance at all. If we have an individual that has a extended history with the compound and is using it on a regular basis, then that person's tolerance is expected to be greater.
So it does depend on the person,
It does.
and here you know nothing about the person.
That is correct.
You indicated that 2.4 milligrams per liter can be toxic or lethal.
Correct. So
Translated to 2,400
that-
nanograms per
milliliter.
milliliter.
Correct.
Okay. But you've also indicated that this amount can simply be the dose that a person uses to see whatever effects that the meth will produce, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And so you don't know whether that is the case in this here, correct?
Correct.
And you are aware of the NHTSA, National Highway Transportation Safety Administration drug fact sheet, correct?
Traffic Safety Administration, but yes,
Okay, thank you. And you've seen that fact sheet before?
I have.
And that fact sheet indicates as to meth that normal concentrations of recreational use are between 0.01 to 2.5 milligrams per liter, correct?
Correct.
And here we have 2.4 milligrams per liter, correct?
Correct.
One of the authors of that study is Dr. Fiona Cooper, correct?
Yes.
And who is Dr. Cooper?
So Dr. Cooper is actually, I mean, technically my boss. She's in my chain of command. So she is recently promoted. I believe she is the commander of the Forensic Laboratory Services Bureau. So in the State Patrol, there are obviously a number of different areas that form the State Patrol. One of which, of course, is you see them on the roads. So that is sort of the operational side of things. There's also the Forensic Laboratory Services Bureau. So we are the scientific branch, and under that, there is at least, there is the toxicology lab, of course, the crime lab, which again breaks down into a number of different laboratories, and then there's the impaired driving section, which are the people that maintain the breath instruments.
She is essentially your boss, correct?
Boss's boss's boss, but yes.
Okay. And so she is one of the co-authors of this study, correct?
Yes.
The other author of the study is Barry Logan, is that correct?
Yes.
Who is Barry Logan?
Barry Logan was the state toxicologist and essentially had the same posting as Dr. Cooper holds currently. He left service of the State Patrol in 2006 and is actually, I believe, well, he works with NMS now, but I believe he's sort of the director of the education branch.
And NMS is the lab
that performed the testing for this case.
And you're aware that Dr. Logan published a study indicating that the range of methamphetamine concentration in recreational abusing population is 0.05 to 9.3 milligrams per liter, correct?
I believe that's probably one of the papers that has contributed to my education.
Okay. And again, NMS lab determined the meth concentration here is 2.5 milligrams per liter, correct?
2.4, I believe.
2.4 milligrams per liter, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And that's below the range of what Dr. Logan determined to be the high end of that range?
It's in that range, yes.
Okay. To be clear here, you're not offering any opinions regarding Mr. Ellis, correct?
Correct. Everything that we've talked about today is for the general population.
Okay. Because you have known nothing about Mr. Ellis.
That is correct.
You were asked if you were able to determine, or you talked about the amphetamine and methamphetamine level, and whether, and in essence, can you determine when a person took meth based on that number?
Correct.
And you were asked that during the interview, correct?
Yes.
And you indicated it would be literally a stab in the dark.
Correct.
Based on what we have here.
Correct.
No, that misstates his prior interview, and I'd ask to show it for you.
Please.
Well, I'll tell you what, before we do that, we're going to go, let's go a little longer than I hoped to. We're now at 11:59, so 11:55, so we're going to take our break now, and we can come back to that issue.